Hello, I'm Leonard Slatkin, here to introduce you to one of the masterpieces of all music, Edward Elgar's Enigma Variations. In 1899, Elgar was not the international musical celebrity that we know him to be now. In fact, these variations became the piece that launched his career. But that launch was very interesting. Why would you write a piece called Variations on an Original Theme and then include the word enigma? An enigma is basically a question. We'll get to that in a moment. But to do that, we need to understand what made this piece so different than any work that came before. It's a theme with 13 variations. These variations each have, as Elgar said, something to my friends pictured within. And if you look very carefully at the top of each variation, you will either see nicknames or initials, or in one place, asterisks. Everybody thought that was the enigma. Who were these people? Elgar didn't say so at first, but then in 1911, he published a small document outlining more or less the people that were contained. Most people were satisfied. But Elgar also said something very interesting. He said that the tune that you hear at the beginning, this original theme, was actually the counterpoint for a larger theme that went through the whole piece, but that was never heard. That's the important part. So I would like you to listen to the first 6 bars of Elgar's work, the so-called original theme. Just listen to it. Don't form an opinion. See what you think. What is this other theme? The real enigma. There have been so many proposed solutions. It could be Rule Britannia, could be a movement from Mozart's Prague Symphony, could be a Stabat Mater of Pergolesi. Dozens of theories have been out there. It could be that the one thing that binds all the characters is the country, Great Britain. The point is, we don't know. Elgar never told us. And that means that everybody interpreting the work can make up their own story. What does it mean to them? So I would like to spend a few minutes to tell you what I think and how I approach the work. What we have in these first 6 bars are groups of 4 notes. The notes change, but the rhythm is always the same. However, there are accents in different places. So to me, I think, despite the fact that the final variation is about Elgar himself, I think this is Elgar as well. Why? Edward Elgar, Edward Elgar. Each time the phrase comes in its 4-note groups, there's a different aspect to it. The accent is on a different note. Some have crescendos and diminuendos. Others are calm. I'd like you to listen to those 6 bars once again and put Elgar's name in and see what you think. Okay, it's just one idea, but for our purposes we have to go with it because that's how I interpret the piece. The first variation is about Elgar's wife, Alice, the light of his life. But it was a different time in 1899. The man was the dominant figure in the household. So what do we hear at the beginning of this variation? We hear Mrs. Elgar possibly complaining, represented by the oboes and the bassoon. Everybody else is playing ultra soft, but here are the oboes and bassoons, well, perhaps reprimanding the composer. As the variation continues, that theme, the original theme, and to my mind, Elgar, gets more and more prominent, and it is Elgar who has the last word in this variation. Variation 2 shows Elgar's love for his fellow musicians, and in this case, amateur musicians. This one is about a pianist, but a pianist who plays a lot of wrong notes. You see, I don't think all of these variations, all of the portraits, are necessarily kind. They're a little cynical, a little sarcastic sometimes, and even though he loved his friends, he wanted to paint them with some of their flaws. So let's listen to the first few bars of Variation 2, and you can hear these wrong notes. At the same time, you'll hear Elgar himself in the low instruments. Another one of Elgar's friends was an amateur violist, but like the pianist, apparently not very good. In this variation, we hear the viola section at the beginning. What I do with it is I ask them to play as if they were amateurs. So there's no vibrato. They're using lots of open strings. The first two bars, you hear them playing this way. They're answered by the cellos, who say, no, this is how it is supposed to sound. And then the violas come back in the next bar, no improvement. A solo viola is heard playing very beautifully, and eventually the section rises to the occasion and plays very, very well. Perhaps the most famous variation in the whole piece is the eighth one, called Nimrod, the nickname for Edward Elgar, who was Elgar's closest friend and also his publisher. Often, this piece is played on sad occasions, as a separate work, perhaps when a member of royalty dies. But it's not that at all. It's a sign of friendship. Some places play the Adagietto from Mahler's Fifth Symphony. No, that's a love letter to Mahler's wife. In the United States, we play the Barber Adagio for strings, which is simply a movement from a string quartet with no story intended. So when we listen to Nimrod, think of that close bond between these two musical friends. Immediately following Nimrod, we have Dora Penny, called affectionately Dorabella. But, like some of the other variations, he makes a little bit of fun of her. Why? She has a speech impediment. She stutters, just a little bit. What you hear at the beginning are the very quiet snickering, the laughter of her friends, sort of making fun of her. And we hear her stutter in the woodwinds, who are written to play ya-pa-pa-pa, but there's a line on the first note, and so we play ya-pa-pa-pa, ya-pa-pa-pa, showing the problem she has in speaking. But at least at the end, Dorabella speaks in a normal cadence, and the friends are surprised. And then, with one little pizzicato, the variation ends. The next variation, and maybe my favorite because I get to make up a story, concerns a man and his dog, a bulldog named Dan, and they are walking by the lake. We don't know that much about the story Elgar intended, but here's the one I want you to listen to. The man picks up a stick and he throws it in the lake. That's the first bar. Then, in the second and third bar, we hear the dog running, representing the bass, sometimes in the tuba. The dog goes in the water, gets the stick, but doesn't bring it back to its owner. The owner is frustrated. He has to go chase the dog, picks up the stick again, throws it in the water. The same thing happens. Finally, at the end, the man picks up the dog and throws the dog into the lake. And the last sound we hear is splash. I don't know if that's what Elgar had in mind, but it's a lot of fun. Not all of Elgar's musical acquaintances were amateur or poor musicians. In fact, he must have been really close and admiring of a particular cellist. This person is heard in the most soulful and beautiful of the variations, which begins with, indeed, the solo cello. There is one variation that to this day still remains slightly mysterious, because that person is not identified by either initials or a nickname. It is 3 asterisks at the top. Who was it? What did he or she do? All we really know is it's someone who went on a voyage by a ship. And Elgar depicts the ship, the sound of the steam engine in the distance. We hear this because the timpanist is playing not with the soft part of the stick, but the hard part, rolling very gently, as if the engine is just off and the boat is sailing away. Also included is a quotation from Felix Mendelssohn's Calm Sea and Prosperous Voyage, heard in the clarinet. We think that the woman is Mary Ligon, who was a very close friend of Elgar, and she was just going away and he wanted to say goodbye in some nice manner. The finale is listed as EDU. This was Alice's nickname for the composer, Edu, and therefore the last variation is Elgar portraying himself. But that's for the entire variation. So how can I say that Elgar is also at the beginning with the theme? because that's only 4 notes, only part that will become the entire work. In the final variation, we hear Elgar himself at his most grand. We hear a reference to his wife and a slight reference again to his friend Jaeger. And it all ends in a blaze of glory. It's very English, it's very noble. You can almost see the crowds at a coronation. But it is the fitting capstone to this magnificent piece of music. I hope all of you will make up your own stories as it goes along. This begs the question, do we have to know who these people were? Do we have to solve the enigma? No. It's just a piece of music. Each of you is entitled to make up your very own story or ask your own questions.